Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Bonham, and in the last series of videos that I did, we talked about running your previously R-written scripts and notebooks on JuliaHub. First by running R itself in the RStudio environment on JuliaHub, and then in starting to translate that R code into Julia code directly. And so I showed how we could install R on JuliaHub and run the R code from within Julia, talked about rcall and using rcall to run R code. And then starting to convert some of that R code into native Julia code itself. In this series of videos, we're going to be talking about NONMEM, which is a set of software that allows you to do pharmacometric modeling. And we're not going to talk about the NONMEM software itself. Mostly we're going to talk about, let's say we have some code that runs from the shell or that uses external programs that we want to run on JuliaHub. We want to maybe intermix it with our Julia code and have that all run seamlessly. So we're going to use NONMEM as an example of this, specifically using the Perl Speaks NONMEM wrapper around that. But really, the content of these videos is going to be to describe how we can run basically any external program and integrate it with our Julia code and run it then from JuliaHub. So in this first video, we're just going to talk about shell integration with Julia and JuliaHub. And so one of my favorite things about Julia, one of the reasons that I started getting really interested in it way back years ago, is how easy it is to interact directly with the shell. And this is evident just from the REPL itself. So if you come into a Julia REPL and you want to run a shell command, let's say you want to do git version control, or you just want to quickly say, like, what's the contents of this directory? I'm going to run ls, etc. You can switch to shell mode by typing semicolon. And then you switch to a shell prompt here. You can see it changes to the color red, and it says shell. And then we can just run whatever kinds of shell programs we want. So for example, ls-l tells us the contents of this directory, just as if you ran this from a typical bash prompt. You can say, what's my working directory? I can ask echo hello world. So anything that you would typically run from the command line, from a bash prompt or a shell prompt, you can run from the shell prompt here in Julia. Maybe not everything. Pipes and stuff are problematic for reasons that aren't worth going into. But if you want to now go back to your Julia prompt, you just hit backspace. And then you're back to running your Julia. And so here, ls doesn't work. That's not actually a function, but instead we can do read dir, for example. And that's a Julia function and tells us what the contents of this directory are. So really easy to just run one-off shell commands from the Julia REPL. But we can also incorporate running external programs, running shell commands from within Julia itself. So the first block of this Quarto notebook, and if you're interested in getting this code, you can go to the video description, and there'll be a link to a GitHub repository that has all of this code. But basically, this says if there's not a directory called nonmem examples, and there's not a file called nonmemexamples.zip, we're going to use the shell command curl, and this command says to follow links and automatically create the output file. And then this link is a group of example files from a Perl Speaks NONMEM tutorial that we're going to download. And so the way that we define this shell command in Julia is using these backticks. So when we make a command, like here, I'll just do this in the REPL here, cmd equals backtick ls-l. And if you're looking for the backtick on your keyboard, it's next to the number 1 on a typical American keyboard. And this creates, it doesn't actually run the program when we put these backticks around it, but it creates a kind of structure called a CMD structure, type of CMD. So you can see it's this capital CMD struct. And this is just, it functions like a string in some ways, but it's this command structure. And then if we want to run the command, we use the run function. So run CMD. And you can see here, I'm defining run CMD for this curl. And then you can also just put the backticks directly inside that run function. So here I'm also unzipping this file if the directory doesn't already exist. And then because this tutorial was originally created on a Mac, there's this extraneous directory here. And so this now is Julia code. It's got the rm just like the shell command, but you can see here recursive equals true, force equals true. That's just identical to if I ran rm-rf on this directory name. And so if we run this, what we'll see now is that the output here is exactly as it would be in the standard out of a shell. We do the curl command, and then we do the unzip command. And now, if you look in our folder, now we have this nonmem examples unzipped. We can delete this zip file if we want. This code block won't run if this directory already exists, so we don't need to keep this file around. And that's it. You can see here I just showed, again, if we want to see the contents of this directory, we can do run ls-l nonmem examples. We see the contents. And of course, we can always run Julia code itself, right? We don't have to parse the outputs of a shell command if they're standard things like ls. Instead, here's an example where we look at the directory contents and then we do stat on those directory contents. And you can see here it has all that same information, the mode of the file, read, write, executable, etc., the size, when it was created, all of that stuff is all inside these this stat file objects from within our Julia script. But again, if you just want to do quick one-off things, you can easily do that from the shell. I should also say, if you do need to capture the output from a shell command, you can do that. So I've got my CMD here now, which is, now we've renamed it to command. So versus this curl command. Let's go back to CMD equals ls-l. If I want to capture the output, I can use the read function. And so I'm going to say read command. So this will, again, run it. And then I tell it what I want to read it as. So it's not a string of bytes, or it's not just a vector of bytes. I want to read it as a string object. So I say read command string, and then I get back a string. And you can see here all of the same content. There's new lines hidden in here somewhere, right? These /l. So if I said, for example, like print line answer, it's going to print nicely because those new lines exist, but all that content is still there. It's just as a string. So if I wanted to actually extract information, I'd have to parse the string, etc., which is more complicated. Okay, so really easy to run external commands. We'll talk about piping and stuff in the next video, so we'll ignore that for now. But just as a sort of last piece of this, here, if you look at this tutorial here, the first command they sort of talk about running is this execute command. Now, in order to make this work on your JuliaHub instance, you need to have NONMEM and Perl Speaks NONMEM installed. If you don't, talk to JuliaHub support. They can probably help you out. If it's on your company instance, then you already have access to this. You also need like licenses and stuff, which we're not going to go into. But basically, this directory, or this here, if our working directory is not this NONMEM examples, this just checks that that's our current working directory. Then it says to switch into this directory, and then we're going to run this execute run 0105, this file here, which has a definition of a model that we want to run. So I'll just run this, and then you can see now the standard output, it's executing the PSN command. All right, and so we get all of our output here. And it's created a bunch of new files as well. So you may have seen a bunch of new stuff show up in this directory. PSN and NONMEM create a bunch of files. We'll talk about how to deal with those again in a separate video. But that's it for this video. So we can use the Julia REPL to easily run shell commands as one-offs. We can also incorporate those shell commands into our Julia scripts themselves. So the next video, we're going to talk about how, if we want to orchestrate kicking off a bunch of independent jobs using Perl Speaks NONMEM, we can do that, again, on JuliaHub from within our Julia script. So I'll see you in the next one.